Yeah, so I linked some of my old tweets because that was kind of, what, you know, initiated kind of what led to this space to begin with. And I'm trying to get and see, if enough people will join in eventually that, we can see all sides of this and let the evidence speak for itself. And based on how big your book is, I think you can confidently say you think the evidence does speak for itself.
Yeah, 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 for sure.
I have been,
So,
go ahead.
no, you go ahead. Yeah, I've never done one of these, so I don't know how you want to proceed. You're the host, so it's up to you.
I guess I was gonna start by saying, so I have read a few chapters today. It was really interesting where he talks about, the problem with the influence of Latinization. It seems like this whole thing of like, it talks about in your book, we often think of like the issues surrounding ecumenism and Latin captivity and Latin, or like ecumenism is a very modern thing, but like really a lot of the Latin captivity, so to speak, back in those times was really a lot of it came from the ecumenism of that time. And the fact that there were literally synods being ran by literally crypto uniates, like literally.
Hmm. Yeah, no, well, yeah, there was certainly a lot of that. There was certainly, things going on, particularly in the 1600s, in the Greek islands that are more extreme than anything that occurs today. I mean, you're talking about dual liturgies served in Orthodox churches with like a permanent stone altar, like permanently built into the church for the Latins to use, where the Orthodox and the Latins would, they'd all be in the church together. They'd have like these dual liturgies, and then, but all the prayers were together. They'd read the gospel together. So obviously, nothing like that happens nowadays. And I think, I mean, if we saw patriarchs or bishops doing that, I think there would be a very strong reaction. So, I mean, as a side note, it's an interesting point against the contemporary old calendarists because there was no such, you know, quote unquote, genuine Orthodox movement at that time, but there was such extreme ecumenism. But that, as a side point, but I mean, the gist of the Latin captivity section of the book, and I'm not claiming to be like some, an in-depth scholar on the Latin captivity. I think it's so demonstrably in your face a historical fact. You don't need to really do that much digging to see it for what it is. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what the Latin captivity is. I think it's strawmanned a bit by certain people who want to deny that this was a historical reality. They'll say things like, "Oh, well, you're denying that there was like legitimate saints," or you're saying, "Oh, all the saints of this time period were all wrong," or you're saying that orthodoxy was lost for a period of time, or other things like this. That's certainly not what I'm saying. That's certainly not what Father George Florovsky, who coined the term. It's not what he was saying. I think that the simplest way to explain it is we're talking about really mainstream society here, right? I think we all are maybe not the most mainstream stream people, to put it bluntly, to put it lightly, with the current state of things. And so it was the mainstream that was captivated by this Latin spirit, but many of the saints were resisting this. So I think it's really important to frame it in that way, that it was really the mainstream. It wasn't so much actually the saints. There was always a current of saints and pious people that were resisting those influences.
Yeah, and what's crazy too is this was a infection that spread everywhere in the church. That as you know, Mount Athos wasn't even spared from this. Like there was a time when there was like that Athonite monks on Mount Athos were being taught by Roman Catholic priest and clergy and stuff, and that you had Athonite monks going to Rome, to get educated and stuff. And I think a lot of people today would would find that shocking.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I guess again, what I would say on that, it was not so much the saints. It was really the mainstream current, so to speak. And we see all kinds of wacky stuff in the mainstream current nowadays, and so that's certainly a common um, historical phenomenon. And I mean, the problem hasn't been solved, completely. Obviously, Father John came along in the 50s with his doctoral thesis, The Ancestral Sin, and that was, a very large contribution in the sphere of academic theology, to fight against this Latinization, particularly in his case, helping fight against it in the seminaries. I mean, people take for granted the way that Orthodox theology is presented to us nowadays. Like, for us, things like theosis, obviously, that's almost like a given, right? Lots of things we take as a given. It was not so much the case in the 50s in the Greek Orthodox world. I mean, you can talk to older Greek people, and they'll tell you, like in GOARC in America, Greek Archdiocese of America, you wouldn't see a prayer rope like at the bookstore in a parish. They were very disconnected from the tradition, and so in his sphere, Father John played a very significant role in bringing things back towards the fathers. Him more so in the sphere of academic theology. I mean, they were teaching Aquinas in Greek seminaries. I don't know exactly precisely when they stopped, but certainly in the 50s, they were teaching Aquinas in Greek Orthodox theological seminaries as though he were a church father. And so people will see the way that Father John speaks, and he's very caustic. He's very negative about um, various things with Western theology, various things that St. Augustine taught, or things that developed out of St. Augustine's teachings. And it's very easy to stand in judgment of him in the context that we're now living in, where you could say, at least in some sense, we're living in a context where those problems have been solved in part because of Father John Romanides. So we have to appreciate the context that he was working in, and what he was trying to do. And he wasn't perfect, and it's valid to criticize the way that he went about it, but I don't think that we're necessarily in a place to stand in judgment of him, however long, 75 years, whatever, 70 years later, and be overly judgmental of the way that he chose to approach things.
So I'll get into the meat and bones of a lot of the dogmatics, especially with my reservations of what's kind of confused me is I'm looking at this section or book where it does talk about types of knowledge, and again, this is where one of the things that confuses me. Maybe you can answer me is where he talks about um, in criticism of metaphysics of Platonism, the idea that there are uncreated forms and patterns which creative things derive their being from.
Mm-hmm.
One thing where that confuses me is it reminds me of something of what I saw Saint Gregory of Nyssa say in his commentary on the Song of Songs about iconography, where like when we look at iconography, we do look at the form, that we don't look at the colors or anything, that it's the form we are looking at. Now, how can maybe there, like, how could you square that with say this criticism of uncreated forms and patterns there? Or is it really, would you say, a distinction between created and uncreated there? But then again, in iconography, we're looking at the logos, who is an uncreated person. So maybe you could kind of explain that.
Um, so one of the according to Romanides, I mean, obviously people can disagree with this, but according to Father John Romanides, there are interpretive keys by which we have to understand theology, right? Interpretive keys, he argues that if you don't have these, you will make mistakes and not understand things properly. Because obviously, like, you can pick up one book from the church fathers. They're not going to explain every little point of everything about everything in one single book, right? But there's these common interpretive keys by which you need to understand the broad corpus of all of the fathers. And so one of those interpretive keys, according to Father John Romanides, is that there is no similarity between the created and the uncreated. So he would say that you have to have that interpretive key in mind when you're approaching all matters of theology, right? I mean, when you're talking about iconography, I mean, icons of Christ, he is he assumed a human nature, right? So insofar as he has a human nature, the human nature is created, and so that is explainable by concepts. It can be visualized. It has a form,
Well,
right?
yeah,
That's the
circumscribed.
created
That's what.
nature, circumscribed. Yeah, but when we speak about things that are not similar in any way, shape, or form to creation, right? We're talking about the uncreated.
So again, but like, what I don't get with that is how does that square with how Christ is depicted before the incarnation, like the Andrei Rublev icon, Abraham and the three visitors. Like one of the three angels is obviously shown as and the angel of the Lord, which is Christ, and that's what I get into, and some of my understanding of iconography I actually did get from one of Romanides students, also is Father Michel Najim, and he was the one that talked about that icons do not portray natures, but they do portray persons. And so when we look at an
Mhm.
icon of Christ, we are still looking at the form of the divine uncreated person of the logos. And within the context, of Old Testament iconography, it's just I'm trying to see what would be a charitable
Uh-huh.
understanding to where that can be reconciled with Romanides theology.
Well, it depends on what you mean by the word form, because these obviously, like, you can mean different things by these words. And there's a part in the book about that where where I look at words like ideas, words like forms, words like archetypes,
What section? I
because
got it
these
pulled.
words don't.
I got it pulled up on my computer.
Yeah.
What section?
Oh, I don't remember, but it's called. I think it's called God and the Idea of God. I think is what that section is called.
Oh, I just found it. Yeah, here it.
Because God is formless, like strictly speaking, God, and when we're talking
The
about the divine
Father. Yeah.
nature, is formless. Now, but it's one thing to like the reason that chapter is called God and the Idea of God is because the fathers make a distinction between knowledge of God and knowledge that God exists. So it's one thing to know that someone exists and to signify the fact that they exist. It is another thing to like describe that person. Like I could say that you exist. It'd be another thing for me to say that you have brown hair, or something like that. So those are two different things. But I would, if I may, like to perhaps pull the discussion back a bit, because I think these questions about analogy and the unknowability of God, they're downstream of other, I think, very important things that are covered in part one of the book. Because part one of the book, my kind of goal with that was to sort of set the stage contextually, both in terms of the historical context, as we discussed with the Latin captivity and Father John's place in history, but then also just more fundamental questions of how do we do theology? Like what even is the purpose of theology at all, right? And basically, the purpose of theology is not to give us like a philosophical system. It's not to give us like a metaphysical system, right? The purpose of theology cannot be divorced from the whole ascetic life of worship, of spiritual guidance within the church. That's the context in which theology exists. It doesn't exist as like an autonomous metaphysical system in the way that a philosophy like Platonism or Aristotelianism might exist. And so I think I'm not trying to attack anyone or anything like that, but the some of the discussions that I see on Twitter, I think, suffer from this incorrect approach to theology, where we are maybe we're not trying to, but I think functionally speaking, we're approaching it as though it's this like autonomous metaphysical system, as though it's kind of just like a superior philosophy, like a better um, version of philosophy. And I really think it's a mistake to view theology in that lens. I mean, if you look at the New Testament, for example, there's very little, maybe none. There's like no systematic theology in the New Testament, right? That it comes along later when heresies arise and the fathers need to, you know, express things in more clear, detailed language and so forth in order to fight against heresies. Now, so presumably, if those heresies had not arisen, would that ever have happened? I don't know, but I mean, if you look at the New Testament, what is it? What are St. Paul's epistles geared around? It's mostly the spiritual life is mostly what he's talking about. Um, and I think that's very telling. And so, yeah, I guess that's my point. You can't. So, and then so when we come back to questions like form and analogy, like I think the problem with how some of these things are approached is, we're coming at it almost like from the realm of philosophy, and we're applying all these categories and these methodologies that are from philosophy, and then we're trying to put orthodox theology into that framework. And I think that's really a mistake to approach it like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I did see in the book, and I would grant, I would agree that it's true that, holy tradition is not passed on, professor to student. It's passed on, spiritual father to confessor, and so on and
Mm-hmm.
so forth.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
um, I'm reading
And if I
too
may,
that.
actually, that reminded me of, I'm sorry to cut you off, but that reminded me of the other important point connected to that I just wanted to make was, I started the book off fairly early with citing what I believe to be an extremely important quote, which is from St. Simeon the New Theologian. And I mean, I won't read it out because I don't have it in front of me, but I'll paraphrase it. And, he basically says that he talks about the golden chain, how the saints form this golden chain. And he says that, obviously you're living in a particular point in history, and you have to connect yourself to the saints immediately preceding you in time. And if you read his life and you understand the whole context of his life, he's talking about the saints who are currently alive. He's not just talking about like the last officially, canonized saint. He's talking about the saints who are actually alive right now. And he says that if you do not express a desire to connect yourself to the most recent saints, that it is impossible for you to be connected to the saints who preceded them. So, in other words, if you express no desire to know who the saints of our day are, either the most recently reposed saints, the saints who are currently alive, the spiritual children of saints, if you make no effort to connect yourself to those people, it will be impossible for you to truly understand, or perhaps in other words, you could say, have epistemic certainty that you will correctly interpret the fathers. Because if you read Saint Hilarion Trotsky's book, I think it's in Holy Scripture in the Church, because I think this applies more broadly than just Holy Scripture. It applies to all of the doctrinal works of the Church Fathers, ecumenical councils, everything. He says if you remove the Scriptures from the life of the Church, it becomes a dead book. And I don't think that's limited to just the Bible. I think it applies to all dogmatic writings. If you remove those from the whole organic life of the Church, of asceticism, of worship, of connection to a spiritual father, of connection to the holy fathers of our day, it is it's certainly my belief that it will be completely 100% impossible for you to not make errors when it comes to dogmatic theology as well. It's just simply not possible. And that's not me. That's what Father Seraphim Rose says. I mean, I posted a quote where he says, if I could get it up, the exact quote. I don't have it in front of me, but he says, we should distrust our own abstract understanding of theology, and we should first ask ourselves, what do our elders say? And I'm familiar that some people on Twitter, they say things like elderism, but I don't know. That's Father Seraphim Rose saying that, and it's not that the elders contradict the church fathers or the ecumenical councils, that they're your link to the church fathers and the ecumenical councils. They're the means by which you have epistemic certainty that you correctly understand the church fathers and the ecumenical councils. Does that make sense? So, and the way that I think that's connected to Father John is, if we apply that principle to the person of Father John Romanides, at least as far as I'm aware, and I'm very open to people, telling me about some elders that they know who say otherwise, but I haven't seen it yet. All of the contemporary elders, all of the contemporary saints who at least have said something about Father John Romanides, they're all very, very positive about Father John Romanides. And so for me, I don't see how someone has any basis to, I mean, you could disagree with this or that, but I mean, people, take very extreme positions calling him a heretic and this, that, and the other thing. I don't really see how you have a basis to say that when you can't point me to any contemporary saint, any contemporary holy elder who is saying those things about Father John Romanides when so many speak so positively about him. Sorry for the long-winded tangent there. But I think it's important to establish, kind of first principles in the way that we approach these questions.
Okay, uh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I wanted you to clarify that background and context because, like I said, I did just because this does caught my attention. I'm on this section here where it talks about maintaining the created and uncreated distinction, and where you mentioned terms like form, loge, archetype, and idea, which you say are taken and sort of reverse engineered by the fathers. One archetype, I mean, one thing I know that's similar is in the Greek is prototype, and again, because I think this is an important question because it's Christological when Saint Basil the Great talks about how respect to the image goes forth to the prototype, which is also means archetype, how Christ is the archetype and stuff.
Mhm.
What would you
Yeah.
how would you characterize in that context when Saint Basil is making that connect he makes that connection there between, a created image obviously to the prototype which is Christ there who is uncreated. How does that fit in the context of the maintaining the created uncreated distinction there? How would you say?
So I don't think these words like prototype, for example, I don't think you can't carry over all the Platonic baggage like from the way that Plato uses that word and then apply it to the church fathers, right? So that's the first thing we have to understand. Like I think in the book there's a quote from Constantine Kavarnos, which basically says that. Like he talks about how the church fathers will use these words that come from Hellenic philosophy, but they don't use it right in the exact same way that Hellenic philosophy has it. So in the example that you just gave with Christ as the prototype, I mean, obviously it's like obviously we know that Christ created the world, right? All things derive their being from Christ. All things are given life by Christ, by the Logos, right? But none of that necessitates the Platonic understanding of prototype, where you have like this immaterial, prototype by which like the material things are, have like their form like sort of based on, right? There's no necessity that you have to sort of carry over all that Platonic stuff when you see the fathers uh, use these words. Is I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, I understand. I've seen and that is kind of a thing. Like I know like the term begotten, which originally means monogenes in Greek. Um, when Saint Athanasius was arguing against the Arians, he proved the fact that even though that meant the creation, a creaturely creation in the old Platonic and Socratic language of the Greeks, that the church fathers turned it into mean something uncreated. So begetting or monogenes in patristic theology means God the Father is generating the Son of his own nature, that the Father is eternally manifesting the Son in an uncreated sense. And that is where, yeah, I would see how, yes, that the church fathers will take the philosophical linguistics that a lot of these Socratics use and they will baptize them to a higher and more holy meaning. It's just and I don't mean to want to pin you down on this, but I'm
Sure.
trying to understand of how you would think Romanides would give the definition of what the patristic definition of what prototype would mean.
When you're talking about like as Christ as the prototype specifically,
Yeah. And
well, Christ is the prototype of all men as the God man, right? But we're getting into like the theology of the incarnation and so forth, right? So that's kind of a different. I mean, it's obviously connected to it, but um, because Christ is also man, right? So he is the prototype of all man as the God man.
yeah, and that's where I've heard some other people make. And this is a common criticism where I've heard people say about Romanides is that with his view on the total distinction between the created and uncreated is that I've heard some people say that in context, how could then Romanides say that we have the imago Dei or image and likeness of God?
Yes, so there is a chapter. The end of part two of the book is called "Man in the Image of God," and it's very short. Like I think you could there could be a lot more said on that. That really did deserve something more comprehensive. Which by the way, I don't claim my book has all the answers, and it probably should have been 1,000 pages. But this is my attempt to maybe just sort of get some of these ideas out there. But in short. Um, there are several fathers who will talk about the image of God in man, basically you could say as man's potential for deification, right? So it's not this like philosophical Platonic sort of thing. It's something much deeper. Than just the way that like the form of a tree is what a tree is modeled after. Like it's something much more deeper. It's to do with how man is meant for deification. It's not like a philosophical sort of a thing.
So like, and that's would be like where image and likeness. That's what likeness would mean too. Really.
Yeah. So the image. Like I think, Saint Sophrony of Essex talks about this. Vladimir Lossky talks about this. So the image, one meaning of the image is man's potential for deification, right? And then so attaining that would be attaining to the likeness, actually being deified.
So it's I guess it would be specifically, is it, would you say the deification or or it's the potential for deification or is it both?
Well, so here's what Saint Sophrony says: created in the image and likeness of God, man is endowed with the capacity to apprehend deification.
Can you say that quote again?
Created in the image and likeness of God, man is endowed with the capacity to apprehend deification, or receive deification, attain to deification. Metropolitan Horotheos Vlachos, he also talks about this in his book, the person in the Orthodox tradition, and he actually talks about how the image of God in man, in one sense, you could say, is we're imaged after Christ. Like, and Christ is the image of the Father, and then we are in the image of Christ, the God Man.
Yeah, and I got it pulled up right here. This chapter. I know we talk about the spiritual life. This is probably one of your favorite chapters in the book. I've had it pulled up right here. The sickness of religion and man's relationship with God.
Yep. Yeah. What about that section?
I guess you could say right here, I see this thing where he rejects personalism, and that was taught by people like Bayendorf.
Yeah. So personalism, I guess, in short, because this is connected to the whole concept of the total dissimilarity between God and creation. And so basically, according to Romanides, the problem with personalism is that they basically try to draw analogies between the Godhead, the persons of the Holy Trinity, and personal relations among human beings, which he says is basically a mistake. So that's, yeah. In short, that would.
You cut out here. Let me move you down to listeners and invite you back up to see.
Okay, so yeah, we were talking about personalism, and yeah, his critique was basically because the mistake was that analogies are drawn between sort of human interpersonal relations and the persons of the Trinity. That's basically his criticism there.
Okay. I'm reading through this section too where it talks about the accusations of nominalism. I see you say like the chief disagreement, when people, even though you say when people accuse Romanides of being a nominalist, is that he agrees to some degree with William of Ockham, but his his key disagreement is how Occam approaches scripture. Is that it?
Um, so he basically he agrees with Occam's critique of the metaphysical theology that was prevalent in the West at the time. Um, that said that you could make analogies. You could kind of use philosophical analogies derived from creation, and you could analogize, make analogies about God. So he rejected that, and Romanides agrees with him. But he goes on, but then Occam goes on to say you can do this thing called what he calls analogy of faith, and he says, okay, well, but we can make an analogy between things from Scripture and God, but Romanides rejects that. So because Romanides obviously, as we've discussed, rejects that there is any analogy whatsoever between created things and God, and that would include the created words of Holy Scripture as well. And so it's been repeated a lot that Romanides is a nominalist, and it's quite amazing that the quote that is based on, like literally on the same page of the book, he goes on to criticize Occam. So like he's obviously not a nominalist. He agrees with one thing that Occam says, but then he goes on to disagree with other things that Occam says.
Okay, yeah. Was it mainly just the analogy of faith part regarding scripture? Was that really just the main thing that Romanides disagreed with Occam on?
Yeah, at least in patristic theology, that's what's discussed. And it kind of gets to Romanides's um, approach to these things in Scripture that obviously differs from Western theology, where kind of as I discussed, the purpose is not to form like a sort of metaphysical system of understanding God with your mind. The purpose is the whole ascetic life, the whole life of worship, asceticism, and guidance under a spiritual father in the church, and progressing through purification, illumination, and theosis within, using these concepts, you could maybe sort of say as training wheels um, to get yourself to the point where you have that experience of God, at which point those concepts are no longer needed because you have the experience itself, which completely goes beyond and transcends those concepts.
All right, yeah. I read this here because this is one of the controversial things that gets thrown at him about the whole spinal fluid thing, and
Yep.
yeah, I've heard that before. I was actually my friend Peter down there and listeners who told me that um the whole thing about that whole spinal fluid thing was just kind of seeing what the effect noetic prayer has on the physical body.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, so that quote, well, it's two, like, as far as I'm aware of what we have in English, there's two essays where he makes like, this is the first thing. It's two essays, and it's like one sentence in each of the essays where he makes a comment about the spinal fluid. So the first thing I would say is it's not like he was talking about spinal fluid 24/7. Like that's how some people, treat it, as though like, oh, he was just always talking about the spinal fluid all the time. He was obsessed with the spinal fluid. Thousands and thousands of pages of works from Father John. It's like two sentences where spinal fluid is mentioned. So we should understand that first, I think. Secondly, though, it's my opinion that I think actually what he said about the spinal fluid is completely in line with patristic teaching about human anthropology and the way that the spiritual life works. I quoted Saint Cleopa of Sahastria, the recently glorified Saint Cleopa of Romania. He says a very similar thing about the effects of noetic prayer. He mentions like the spinal cord. I cite a bunch of scientific studies in the book that I think give credence to the theories of Father John around the connection of the heart and the spinal fluid. And then I quote a bunch of different saints. I quote St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov. I quote St. Greg of Palamas. I quote St. Nicodemus. And through that material that I present there, I mean, you see that it's a very clear teaching of the fathers that there is a connection between the um, physiological processes in the body and realities of, the soul and the spiritual life. It's a basic patristic teaching, um, that the nous, when it's working properly, is located in the heart, in the physical organ of the heart, like the literal, actual physical heart. And the fathers are very clear about that. And so I don't think it's at all, out of line with patristic teaching that Father John would, make an attempt. And maybe, I personally think it seems like he was on the right track, but, you could try to argue that he got it wrong in terms of like the particulars of the science. But all he was trying to do was take contemporary science, contemporary neurobiology, and reformulate these patristic teachings in modern scientific language. Now, whether or not he did that accurately when it comes to the science, that can be debated. It's my personal opinion that he was on the right track there. But I think what can't really be substantiated is that he was just, totally off the rails, totally crazy. No, I think he was completely in line with patristic understanding when he said that. I think that quote is just, like so many things online. It's all about little cheap shots, little quick little zingers, and not so much of a willingness to dissect things in a deeper way. And it's easy to just take that one little quote and share it around and make fun of it. But if we take it seriously and we say, okay, what is Father John saying? It's actually not. It's actually not really that crazy.
Hmm. So I'm reading here. I found the section you talked about, and I'm reading through. I'm reading through where you have the quote. It says Romanides says about that man is fashioned in the image of God, but he is not the image of God.
Yes. Oh, that's yeah. So that's an important distinction to make, and I think that distinction is often lost when people talk about this. Um, and people who know more about Greek can talk about the particulars of the Greek, but and I've spoken to such people, is that it's what it's saying is man is made it's in the image, or alternatively it could be translated as according to the image of God, but so that's different from saying man is the image of God, right? Man is not the image of God. Man is made in the image of God, and that's an important distinction, because that gets us away from like that overly philosophical, overly Platonic, sort of a way of approaching it.
So I want to get into the one thing that I still don't, regarding iconography is before Christ had a human nature, which would be circumscribed. Um, if there is absolutely no similarity between the created and uncreated, how how was he able to be seen in the Old Testament theophanies?
So if you look at the language of the various visions that the prophets have, like the language that they'll use is they'll always say, I saw something that was it was as this, but it wasn't, like it was as a river of glass, or a river of this language that they use, but never that it is what they're describing. So what Romanides would say, and it's interesting because a lot of people, I saw people act like this was some crazy thing, but there was theosis in the Old Testament. I mean, when the prophets are having these, whether it's Ezekiel or Isaiah or Elijah or whoever it is, when the prophets are having these exalted divine visions, that is theosis. So theosis does exist in the Old Testament. So what they're experiencing is uncreated, right? It's completely beyond concepts, but they're still trying to formulate that in some imperfect way within concepts, because that's all that we're capable of with words, when we write down words and stuff. But as I just kind of discussed before, you have to think about it in a different way, where the point is not to give you a philosophical understanding, and this is what part two is all about. The point is to point the way for you to get to that experience yourself. And a metaphor that I would perhaps use is like, if you're climbing a mountain and there's like a path, that leads to the top of the mountain, there might be signs and there might be markers that point to the mountain. They say, go this way and, you'll get to the top of the mountain. But those markers are not the mountain. Those markers are in no way similar to the mountain. And when you get to the mountain, you're not going to be referring to the markers anymore, right? So you kind of have to think about it in a different way, if that makes any sense. That's maybe the first thing I would say.
So like when the prophets speak of Christ, as the angel of the Lord, he he did not literally look like an angel at all when he appeared to them.
Well, angel means messenger, right? So he's delivering a message. I mean, God can do whatever he wants. There are times when God um, might make some physical sort of phenomenon happen to someone, and they see that, or he might make a physical audible voice heard in a room to someone. God can do whatever he wants, of course, but when we're talking about like visions and experiences of the uncreated energies, these things are not similar to created things. And I think, as far as I understand, that's how we should understand the theophanies of the prophets in the Old Testament. Like when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and he sees God, that's theosis. Now there's descriptions of what that experience was like, but again, I think what I'm kind of arguing and what Romanides would say is that the way that we have to understand the words used there is they're meant as like guideposts. They're meant as like something pointing us towards something that ultimately is completely beyond and completely, infinitely surpassing those words, right? The point is not to think about it in like a philosophical way. The point is to have those concepts and have those words within the whole life of worship and asceticism and spiritual healing, because I mean, words and concepts, they have an effect on the soul even, right? If you have certain words and certain concepts, it like directs your whole life. It like directs your whole soul. So I think we have to think about these things in a different way. I mean, obviously by nature of conversations like this and conversations that occur on Twitter, we sort of take as a given this like extremely philosophical approach. But I think that's kind of the problem, is that we're approaching it like that.
I see. So like the whole thing is like you would say Romanides would say that when the apostles try to describe the messenger or the logos that they see in visions, with theosis and stuff, when they use sort of language that, describes some way can understand, that's just them think of the best comparable thing in human terms what they described, but even that is like nothing, even
Yeah,
that isn't really any kind of
yeah,
definition of what
yeah,
they saw.
yeah, and and this is connected to, because another point I'd make is you see this sort of, people will draw this distinction between what they consider like a dogmatic text, like something like on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius, and a spiritual text, like something like the Ladder of Divine Ascent by Saint John Climacus, and they'll say like, okay, well this one's dogmatic and this one's spiritual, but I think that's actually like an artificial distinction. It's all dogmatic and it's all spiritual. So you cannot um, evaluate like theology, Trinitarian theology, Christology, any theology divorced from the spiritual life, divorced from asceticism, divorced from purification of the nous from thoughts and passions. Because if you read the ascetic literature, right, and you actually read about how they talk about arriving at the experience of God, one of the fundamental ideas is the purification of the nous from thoughts. Right now, we talk a lot about purification of the nous from passions. Obviously, like we try to get the passions under control. Right, we try not to get angry. We try not to hate people. We try not to eat too much. Right, that's obvious. But the other part of that too is purification from thoughts. Right, removing all thoughts, all images, in other words, anything created from the nous. So it's the teaching, the clear, teaching, and all the ascetic literature of the church is that you cannot see God if you have anything created in the nous, right? All created images, thoughts, words, concepts, et cetera, have to be removed from the nous in order to see God. I think that's, that's very important, and that's directly connected to this whole thing that we're talking about with analogy, with the dissimilarity of God to creation. And when we read in the ascetic literature about how prayer is surpassed in the experience of theosis. You go beyond prayer, right? All words, all prayers, all thoughts are set aside and abolished and surpassed in the experience of God. You can't separate all those spiritual writings from the dogmatic theology. It's all one reality. It's all one reality together. You can't like, I mean, you can talk about it separately, but ultimately it's not actually separate at all.
Last question I would have is, we say how we can't use we can't use human philosophical analogy to really describe God at all. But then I've heard you say in discussions that there is still a sort of patristic linguistic about analogy. Like, I guess could you just elaborate a bit more on that?
So in the book, we talk about what Christos Yanaris coined this term analogy of hierarchy, which by the way, I don't endorse everything Yanaris taught. He had some kind of big errors and so forth, but I think he got this. I think he expressed this very well. And so, if I could just read this, this is not very long. I'll just read this out. He says, analogy is hierarchy, knowledge as a power analogous to the stages of existential perfection or the transcendence of alienation, does not represent an intellectual methodological scheme for grading the quantitative differentiations of knowledge, but articulates an existential reality with knowledge as an experiential universal participation in this reality. Knowledge transcends a static intellectual understanding. It is rather a hierarchical order of the powers, not the quantitative differences of knowledge. It is a comprehensive sacred order within whose bounds the transmission and every personal existence is raised up in proportion, analogos, to the imitation of God. The entire existential and cognitive hierarchy is an order and energy which ascends dynamically to the imitation of God. The transmission of knowledge constitutes purification and illumination and perfection. The difference between Byzantium and the West is a difference between two comprehensive epistemological ethical views of the world, humanity, and God. This difference could be summarized in the contrast between the objective, quantitative understanding of analogy and the understanding of analogy as hierarchy. Now, that's a little bit dense, a lot going on there, but I think he expressed that excellently, and it goes back to what I said about the whole context of the ascetical worship life of the church, right? The life of spiritual ascension. You cannot divorce the conceptual dogmatic teachings of the church from this life and treat it as an autonomous metaphysical system. That's not the purpose of it. It's part of this whole life of spiritual ascension. Is kind of what Yanaris was going. I mean, people can go back look at that quote. It's you can control F on the website. I think he expresses it really fantastically there.
I think that kind of covers just
Cool.
about all questions I
Yeah.
would have.
Yeah. No
So,
worries, man. I don't know if we want
if
to.
it,
If there's anyone else on, it could let people ask some questions, maybe.
yeah, I was gonna open it up to anyone. We got one guy who requests to be a speaker, and then anyone else who's listening if they want to ask any questions.
Oh yeah, what's up? I'm just kind of listening. I kind of edit notes and documents when I listen to Twitter Spaces a lot. But um, I'm talking to a Mormon right now, and they're talking about the ex nihilo stuff. God made every how matter's eternal and whatnot, and it's uh, Saint Athanasius covers this beautifully. Insanely, this dude was like 20 years old when he wrote this. He's talking about how Why would matter exist? You're questioning basically the omnipotent God. And it's like he says, how could God be called maker and uh, uh, artificer if his ability to make depended on some other cause, namely on matter itself? So it's like, well, if you're saying matter is eternal, you're questioning overall his omnipotent ability, yet you still say he's omnipotent. You know, I thought that was interesting because it's just with Mormonism, it's so weird how they think that like everything's existed and God made everything out of this eternal material. Well, if God's eternal, material is eternal, then that means matter is God as well.
Yeah, or you
It's
have a
like,
dualism, or you have a kind of dualism.
yeah, it's confusing. It's just, I don't know. It's like, how are you gonna even everyone states God's, at least Mormons do, or some, anyone who's a monotheist, at least they claim God is, or let's say a Abrahamic, some branch of cult that's molded from the Abrahamic religions. So Jehovah's Witness or Mormons, like they think God is um, omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. Yet um, Mormons, they think that they're contradicting themselves by stating there's eternal matter. It's just like you say he's this, but then you're
Yeah.
saying something else is that at the same time, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, I have a friend who used to be a Mormon, and I don't know how anyone can stay Mormon. They believe some wacky stuff.
Yeah, bro. I just it's just like it's like I don't even know how to say it. It's almost like it's the logic is all ambiguous. It's so strange. I've never like when you start to realize like think about Mormonism, like their theology. It's so weird, dude. It's like whoa, it's like a brain smoothie almost.
Yeah, well, I mean, they don't have the created uncreated distinction, which is so important.
Yeah, you guys are Orthodox, right?
Yeah, that's the whole point of this space,
Nice.
to discuss Orthodox dogmatics. So did anyone else in the audience have anyone can just request to speak if they had any questions for the author here?
I actually got a question, I guess, because I'm in the realm of Orthodox catechumen, but with your I got an answer from Father Christopher Siskos, and it was talking about our nous, and he says the nous is the highest aspect of man's being, the highest aspect of man's soul. So it's safe to say that whenever we're growing in theosis and trying to be united with God, that means uh, our nous is like we're digging into our nous, and the more we grow in union with God, the more it's like we're digging for a diamond almost. Is that reasonable to say? Spiritual diamond, so to say.
Yeah, I think you could say that. Um, we have to first even find the noose, right? Because I mean, people don't even have an awareness of what that faculty in themselves it is. So it's finding that, recognizing that, and then the struggle to purify the noose from all passions and thoughts.
Is that how you would find it? Is just trying to quote unquote be, like Christ to the utmost? I mean, or try to obviously, but yeah,
Um,
what exactly is like
well,
it's like the
it's you have. I mean, following the commandments, of course, um, guidance under a spiritual father, living the life of the church. I think is just what I would say. Because I'm not anyone's spiritual father, so I don't want to I don't want to give anyone spiritual advice. But if you, in terms of books, I think it'd be very good for you to read Orthodox Psychotherapy by Metropolitan Horotheos Vlachos. If you kind of really want to get an understanding of what the noose is, I would read that book.
yeah,
Oh,
I'm looking at that right now. Yeah.
I did have
Psych-
one question. I remember I was going to ask this now. I noticed like in your book, you're very, very critical of, Platonic philosophy and its terms. I'd like to ask how you square that with, some of the earlier fathers, like Saint Justin Martyr, spoke very highly of Plato and the Socratics in the sense that they were starting to create a logocentric system, which kind of paved the way for orthodoxy in the Greek-speaking world, and went as far as to say Plato was surely one of the first people to recognize Christ when Christ entered and harrowed Hades.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. How do you? Okay. Yeah. No, I get what you mean. How do you square that? So obviously, I mean, I forget. I can't remember if it's Vatopedi, one of the monasteries on Athos, not in the temple, in the trapeza or maybe like a hallway or something. They have icons, not with halos, but like they look basically like icons
yeah,
of the Greek philosophers, right? And there's a life of a saint, I think, where Plato, the philosopher Plato, appeared to someone and basically said that that he accepted Christ's preaching in Hades, right? So there's this whole idea of the logos spermaticos, right? That there was seeds of truth, seeds of kind of pointing people in the right direction, obviously with some things that are not correct mixed in there. Um, but that because these philosophers, you could say to an extent, were doing the best they could, just speculating with their own mind. But here's the thing. So we have that, but then on the other hand, Platonism is anathematized in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. So we have to take those two things together. That's not a judgment on Plato as a person, but I mean, it's kind of like, okay, well, but the truth has been revealed to us now. We have Pentecost. We have the coming of Christ and the incarnation and the pouring out of the Holy Spirit and the whole reality of the church now. So it's time to set these philosophies aside. Basically, is what the church is saying. And there is a positive sense in which the word philosophy is used in the fathers, because like the word philosophy is just love of wisdom, right? And so the truest philosophy is love of God. And um, there's a term called, like, I think Saint Maximus calls it practical philosophy, and that's basically to do with like the ordering of the spiritual life. So in a sense, there is philosophy in the church, but it's the philosophy, you could say, of how to live the spiritual life. But what the fathers criticize so strongly is the whole speculative philosophical approach to the divine, because the approach of the church to the divine, the formulation of theology, is not based on speculation, it's based on experience.
okay, yeah, I see that. So, is there any other questions
Yeah.
from
Oh,
anyone?
you wrote this book?
Yes.
Uh.
Or
Oh,
which book?
nice.
Which book?
Yeah.
I didn't write Orthodox psychotherapy, but
In thy light shall we see light.
the yes, yeah.
Wow. I'm gonna buy this. Wow. Uh. On the back it says. I'm sorry. I haven't been listening. I didn't know this was you who wrote it. I'm sorry. Forgive me, man.
No,
I
no
wasn't
worries.
listening. Uh. Like when it says the man-made philosophical and religious systems of the world, is that just like how everything got like through the lens of Greek and all that, or like Greek philosophy, or what exactly?
Um, yeah, I mean, because you could say um, that is the chief difference, right, between Orthodox theology and whether it's Greek philosophy, whether it's Islam, whether it's Buddhism, whatever it is. The common trait of all those heterodox religious systems and philosophical systems is the source is man, right? The source is man's speculative mind, just kind of, thinking about what he thinks makes sense about God, the divine, or whatever, whatever particular beliefs they have. But the source of Orthodox theology is experience, right? It's the experience of those who have passed through purification, illumination, theosis, and have attained to the experience of God. And they then attempt to communicate something of that experience to us, not with the purpose of giving us a philosophical understanding, not with the purpose of giving us some sort of autonomous metaphysical system to sit around and pontificate on, but the purpose is to lead us to that experience. It has no purpose whatsoever outside of this. And Romanides is quite bold in how he speaks. Like, he says that dogma is absolutely useless if it does not heal you. If dogma is not incorporated into a life of asceticism, worship, guidance by a spiritual father, and moving through purification, illumination, and theosis, then it's completely useless. Is what Romanides says.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of I mean, you obviously know this, but the average Christian doesn't like them. Maybe they do, but I've like the last 2 weeks, I've really read about a lot of spiritual delusion because I got baptized in an Assembly of God, and it seems like, all these individuals who think they're in the spirit or think, that's something
Hmm.
about that category of learning in orthodoxy really
Yeah.
got my attention because it's like it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
God, the God is in me. It's like
Right.
that's
Well, actually,
40,000
okay.
denominations saying that.
Yeah, well, that's actually that's you remind me of a very important point by bringing that up, because what someone might think is like, okay, you're saying it's all about experience, right? But how do you know someone has the experience? Like, you see these Protestants and they're rolling around on the floor or whatever, right? They say they have the experience of God. We have Saint Paisios, right? He says he has the experience of God. So how do you determine who's right? They're both saying they have the experience of God. So what is the basis by which you judge who has it or not? And Romanides, he liked to make a lot of comparisons to the practical sciences, like whether it was astronomy or surgery and so forth. And so the way that these experiences are judged as to whether or not they're legitimate or not is similar to how you would judge how scientific observations are legitimate a lot. Like if some astronomer comes along and says that there's a giant frog in outer space, right? Well, all the other astronomers, they can get their telescopes out and say, well, no, we're looking up there and there's not a giant frog in outer space. Like you're clearly kind of crazy, right? And so the experiences are confirmed because um, the experiences of our contemporary saints are confirmed by the fact that they are in line with the experiences of all the fathers who came before them, right? They all have the same experience. They all say the same thing. If people start coming along and they have new experiences, like I mean, for example, in the post schism West, we start seeing things like the stigmata, right? That's completely unknown to the church of the first 1,000 years. So we start seeing these new things, these new experiences, people talking about God in different ways than the fathers talked about. We then know that these people do not actually have the experience of God.
Yeah, yeah, Father Seraphim Rose, he covers that really well in Orthodoxy Religion of the Future, chapter 7. And at first, I really, I didn't understand because I'm only like 6 months in the Orthodoxy. I'm in the realm of catechism, and I'm not baptized or chrismated. But the last like three months, I've really been, putting in my time to learn, and uh, I never understood what they meant by Jesus didn't laugh or smile and stuff like that. But I understand slowly now how
Mhm.
this fake laughter and emotion that you get when one gets baptized or one thinks God is in them. It's who's to say it's not a false spirit, like a mediumistic spirit that you're not even aware of.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Father Seraphim Rose, I think, says. I think he likens contemporary Pentecostalism to like shamanism, basically.
Yeah, bro. I'm about to get your book on Amazon, bro. Very interested in this.
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the interest.
I apologize for the newbie question I'm about to ask. I saw on Orthodox Twitter that there's a thing that Protestants allow or in maybe de facto that Orthodox doesn't, where someone will say I'm going to sin, knowing that I'm going to repent afterwards, and that Protestant believes you can get away with that, but Orthodox doesn't. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, or maybe I'm completely wrong about what I've heard?
So I think I understand what you're saying. So because it's this very like minimalistic, um, legalistic approach to spiritual life, right? Of like, well, I just whatever I did these sins and I just ask for forgiveness and then I'm good, right? But Saint Paisios had a Greek word called philotimo, which probably Orthodox people are probably familiar with this word, but it could mean love of honor. is what it literally means, but it kind of has it has a connotation of like a love for sacrifice. And basically, we have to have philotimo to be saved, right? We have to love God to be saved. We can't approach our relationship with God as this like mechanical, transactional system, or like I mean, if you have a wife and you say, "Oh, I'm just going to hit my wife and I'll ask her to forgive me later, so it's no big deal." I mean, do you love your wife if that's your attitude? I don't know. I don't know if you
No,
do.
you don't.
Right? You're eager, right? You're eager to sacrifice for her. You're eager to, set aside something you want and do something that makes your wife happy. I mean, there's similarities between that and our relationship with God, and that's how we grow and receive more grace and live out this whole process of our lives of spiritual healing. So much of the West has turned it into this mechanical, transactional sort of a thing that I think is really unfortunate.
So, someone I saw who isn't speaking, but actually did request a comment. Okay, there's two questions posted. I'm going to read the first one. It says, Spermaticos is asking to speak a bit how you can say the logoi are distinct from Platonic ideals.
Yeah, so there's a chapter on this in the book. And by the way, if anyone didn't know, like the book, I have you buy a physical book, which is nice to read on Amazon, but the whole book is also available for free on my website. So if you wanted to just like look at one particular section or whatever, you can look at it there. So there's a section on the logoi, and there's this very strange misunderstanding of what the logoi are, and that has, as far as I can tell, I guess it's been Jay Dyer that has popularized this, that they're forms, right? But they're actually not forms. And if you look at some of the material in that chapter, Saint Maximus is very clear on what the logoi are, which they are the uncreated wills of God towards created things. He refers to Saint Dionysius the Areopagite,
Wait,
who
uncreated wills? Wills in
wills,
a plural? In a plural sense?
yeah, wills or energies. You could also just call them energies too. Yeah, not that God. Well, to be so specific, like if you want to talk about it in like the way that the Christological debates, they talk about Christ having two wills, right? The divine will and the human will. So, like strictly speaking, there's one divine will, right? But there's also a sense in which we can talk about wills of God, like God wills this or God wills that, right? So yeah, sorry, just to be clear about what's meant by that. Or you could also talk about them as energies, right? And so they're not forms; they're the pre-eternal, uncreated wills of God towards particular things, right? So in the Platonic view of it, right? Like for example, you have like tree, right? There's like the logoi of a tree that is like essentially the form of a tree, and all trees like derive their, treeness, you could say, from this form, right? That's actually anathematized in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which is quoted in the book. I don't know if I could find it real quick, but it's in the book. If you look in the book, this is anathematized in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. So to equate the logoi with forms, you actually fall under the anathema there that rejects the Platonic ideas. There's no necessity for ideas. It's kind of what I was saying before. Like we need to kind of get away from this approach where we're assuming all these like philosophical things that are really alien to Orthodox theology. So there's no forms. God, it's basically, you could say God just simply wills trees to be trees. He wills, rocks to be rocks. But there's no necessity that it's like a form. There's no necessity that there has to be Platonic forms. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, he says this seems also important for the issue of all things participate in creative energy of God, but not in his glorified energy. Only the angels
Yes.
and saints participate in the glorified energy. That creative energy of God exists in creation. And then Theophan said, can you speak on the apophatic approach to the energies Father John promotes as opposed to the cataphatic approach?
Yes. So there's a chapter in the book called how the I think it's called how the divine energies are known, or the divine energies in Orthodox theology, is what the section is called. And the short of it is that this mistaken idea is that, because we all hear, for Orthodox, we're all familiar with this idea about how, we would say, we don't know the essence of God, but we know the energies of God, right? I think that's like a very commonly heard basic thing. But the question then is, how are the energies known, right? In what way are the energies known? They're not known in a conceptual, rational sense, right? They're known because we experience them. They're known because we participate in them. Because the energies are essential energies. There's this approach to theology where the energies are sort of treated as like things. I would put like things in quotation marks. Like they're these things like in and of themselves. The energies are the energies of the essence, right? They are the operation and activity of the essence. And so to say that you can describe the divine energies with concepts is the same thing as saying that you can describe the divine essence. Now, and there's a whole section about the divine names, and because when we talk about God's, like you mentioned, right, like God's glorifying energy. Well, what does that mean that we call it the glorifying energy? Are we like describing what the energy is? No, we're describing what it does. It glorifies you, right? So the concept is from creation. The concept is the effect that the energy has upon creation, what it does in terms of its operation within creation. It's not like philosophically describing what the energy is, if that makes sense. Now, when people attain to theosis, they experience obviously the glory of God. They at that extremely high level, and they know God directly, right? Because this is what will distinguish us from Roman Catholic theology with absolute divine simplicity. Is they would deny this direct knowledge of God in this life, like they would deny that it was the uncreated light that was seen on Mount Tabor, right? But the kind of knowledge that this is not rational intellectual knowledge. It's noetic knowledge.
Is it kind of like how, like in like Wonderful, like Judges 13:18 or Psalm 139:6, like God's name is, it's like unfathomable.
Mm-hmm.
So like we have to give a singular name to it or a word to it, but that's still obviously beyond it, like
Yeah,
the essence.
yeah. It's all from creation. Like that's what Saint Dionysius says is all these names, all these words are from creation. I mean, and you can say that God is wonderful, and that is a true statement, right? But we're speaking from within our limited perspective in creation. But like wonderful is not like the definition of what God is. And ultimately God is totally beyond, totally dissimilar to any of these words and concepts that we can construct. Right. But they point us to God. That's the importance of them. And that's what, because Romanides has been accused of like relativism, right? Because he says this, and some people will say, well, he's saying that dogma just doesn't matter, right? Because if the dogmas ultimately aren't actually similar in this like philosophical way to God, then they're meaningless, right? And so my response to that is guiding you through purification, illumination, and theosis is not meaningless. It is the most important, the most important thing in all of human existence, right? Romanides is very clear that it is impossible to reach theosis without orthodox dogma, right? So the purpose of orthodox dogma is within that whole context. As I've said several times, it cannot be treated as this autonomous, detached, like metaphysical system. That's not what Orthodox theology is.
It's kind of like because I'm still ignorant to learning this. Uh, it's like if that's meaningless, it's almost like you're trying to cleanse your own individual soul if that doesn't matter, then it's like, why would you even clean in the terrestrial realm as well? Like, why would you clean your house? Like, if there's no reason behind stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, we have to also understand too that, like, the way that we communicate, like, we're using words, right? We're using concepts, these like thoughts of the logical faculty of the mind. Like, all of this is fallen. All of this is a reality within the fallen world, and it's very imperfect, and we can't even really begin to understand how limited and imperfect. There's I think it's at the beginning of his commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew, where St. John Chrysostom, obviously, he thinks the scriptures are very important. But the way that he begins his commentary on the Gospels is he makes this analogy of like writing someone a letter, right? He basically says, like, you only write someone a letter if they're not with you. Like, I write someone a letter because they're somewhere else, right? If they're here in the room with me, I'm not going to write them a letter. I'm just there because they're right there, right? And he says this is like what scripture is like. He's like you need scripture because you are not with God. And I think we can apply that to all dogmatic theology, all concepts. Like, we have all this as like a next best thing, right? We have all this because we're fallen, because we've, because it's the week right now. Because we're the prodigal son, because we've left the Father's house, and the purpose of all these things is to guide us back to the house of the Father. It's not to have a cool philosophy. It's not the purpose.
Yeah, man. It's like God's house is unfathomably clean, right? So we got to like really make our bed every day. Dumb. I don't know. I don't know. I say stuff in a dumb, easy way, but I don't know. I'm slowly learning. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
cool. Yeah. Was there any other questions, or I guess stay on for a little bit
Dude,
longer?
I have a ton, dude. I have so many. I ask my hair monk quite a bit, and you know, uh, I don't know. I'm just kind of
Well,
listening,
I'll have to
learning.
go to sleep soon for work, so we can go on for
I
another
know. I'm
few
sorry
minutes.
that
We can
I
go
know.
on for
Sorry, I
another
was so
few
late in the
minutes.
day.
We can go on for another few minutes if anyone has a couple more questions, but I'd say in about 5 minutes I'll go ahead and end the space.
I'm gonna steal that quote. I wrote that down. God's house is unfathomably clean, so we need to make our bed every day. I'm gonna steal that one.
Yeah, bro. Spiritual Windex. That's the Holy Spirit.
That's good. That's really good. I see someone has like a hand up. I think that's probably means a question, right?
My question is, so I've been seeing a lot of debate about purgatory. What is the Orthodox stance on purgatory?
We didn't. Yeah, in short, we don't believe in purgatory. Yeah, we don't believe in purgatory.
Because there was this video of a Western Rite priest talking about purgatory, and it caused a little bit of scandal. I think it was done by Roots of Orthodoxy.
I haven't seen it, so I don't know what he says. I mean, the guy who runs that channel isn't even Orthodox himself, which is kind of weird. But we live in a crisis right now, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, and some priests might say some odd things, but we definitely don't believe in purgatory. Definitely not.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no other questions from anyone, I don't see all the names, but our friend with the spiritual Windex said he had a lot of questions. Maybe we could do one more from him if there's no other questions.
Man, I got quite a bit, but um, like yeah, no. I guess that's not really a question. It's more of a statement. It's about like it's irrelevant to Mormons. I've kind of got Mormons on my mind tonight.
You got a lot of interesting one-liners.
Yeah. Do I really? I don't think I've ever been told that. Uh, yeah, but yeah, man, I'm gonna read your book and then we'll discuss further after I read it. So
Yeah, wonderful. And my book's not that good. You should definitely read Father John Romanides too. Can't recommend him highly enough. Obviously,
yeah, I'm looking at him right now. Is he on Amazon as well, or?
Patristic Theology is definitely on Amazon, and that's like a good sort of starter book on Romanides. His Empirical Dogmatics series, I would say, is like when you're kind of you're kind of really getting into the meat of that, and it might be on Amazon, but I mean, you go on Google, you should be able to find it.
Yeah, I'm gonna get that too. I'm also gonna get Theosis, the true purpose of human life.
Yes, yeah, very good, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah, man. God bless you guys. That's it for now, I guess. On to the next space.
Yeah,
All right.
keep that house clean, man.
Bro, I know. All right, man. See you later.
Henry and Spermaticos, you can both go real quick. After that, we'll end it.
I have like two questions. I will be brief. The first one is relating with the idea of theosis. So I want to ask: we only know logoi, God's will, through the participation of the uncreated energy in theosis, and out of this, the only thing that we have is a dark nous. So we have no experience. We have only speculation. And secondly, what was the issue of Augustine as a main confusion, especially because I believe that he confused the idea of logoi with archetypes, correct? The fathers use archetypes, that they are formless, and Augustine kind of confused archetypes with forms in itself. Is this correct?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
And how about the issue of experience outside of theosis? Would we say that it's a dark news that we have, only the will of the fallen nature? Because we only know the logi in terms of God's will through theosis, correct? Only the saints and the angels.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, experientially. I mean, it's not like the way to understand purification, illumination, and theosis. It's not like levels. It's not like levels in a video game where you have level 1 and level 2. There's a sense in which it's linear, but there's also a sense in which like it's sort of a circle, because you're always being purified. Even one who has attained to some experience of theosis, that person is still being progressively purified, progressively um, being able to experience more of that vision. So it's not like I'm done with purification and then now I graduate, to illumination and now I graduate to theosis. It's not like that. It's like simultaneously linear and like also um, sort of circular at the same time. So I mean, those of us without exalted spiritual lives, God may give us like a flash, like little flash of lightning, maybe a few times throughout our life or like something like that. But then you have the exalted saints who are just, the incredible miracles, incredible clairvoyance, incredible visions of God, right? So, it's all about how much have you loved God? How much have you purified your heart? How much of God's divine energies are you capable of receiving?
So it's a bit of a spiral.
Yeah, I think you could say it's like a upward, like a spiral, like an upward spiral going up a mountain. You could say. Obviously, it's an imperfect analogy. We can't get too, systematic about it, but it's a useful way to think about it.
And
All
then
right.
out of it is a dark news. Out of this is only darkness in terms of.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
All
Yeah.
right. All right. I really got to get to
All right.
bed,
Yeah.
so I'm
No
gonna
worries,
end on
man.
that note. But I'm gonna close this space with a little bit of Agni Parthane to end it. All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone.